Hello and good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar and the first of March for us, breaking down the complexities of global mobility. Thank you to everyone that is currently dialed in. Before we jump to the main presentation, I just want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and we will send out a link to download the recording after today's presentation. And throughout the presentation, we also encourage everyone currently listening in to ask some questions. So if you'd like to ask some questions throughout the presentation, please do so using the question function that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try to get to those questions toward the end of the main presentation. All right, so for those unfamiliar with Envoy, for nearly 20 years, Envoy has been on a mission to fix the inefficient, confusing, and frustrating immigration process. Envoy combines expert legal representation with innovative technology to deliver the only platform that makes it seamless for companies to hire, manage, and mobilize a global workforce. Envoy secures work authorization in 150 plus countries, has grown 46% year to date, and works with over 1,000 customers. We are particularly proud of our NPS score, which is a testament to the employee experience that we provide. So for today's presentation, I'm very, very excited to introduce our main presenter, Natacha Sittner, GMS. Natacha Sittner is a talent mobility thought leader in building end-to-end global mobility programs, which drives employee experience and aligns with businesses' talent strategy and company culture. Natacha held mobility leadership roles at Netflix and LinkedIn, where she had the opportunity to be part of the company's strategy to expand globally and hire the best talent for the business. Natacha is an advocate for the importance of mobility in the overall talent strategy of the organization, and to that point spends her time coaching, educating, and guiding HR and business leaders in the area of talent mobility. Natacha, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to have you on today.
Thank you, Eric, for the opportunity. I'm excited to join this one too.
Great. Natacha, before we head into the main presentation, I just want to give our attendees a brief look at our agenda, just so they can we can see what we're going to be talking about here. So we're going to kind of break it down into two main parts. First part, we're going to just briefly discuss current global talent landscape, and then head into these complexities in global mobility and just kind of break them down and just discuss those further. So without further ado, let's head into the main presentation and the current talent landscape. So briefly, I just want to talk about, Natacha, what we're seeing out there. That, I don't think it's a big secret that the talent landscape is shifting, and this transformation, as I'm sure you are well aware, it's redefining the the supply and demand for talent. Mm-hmm. So as a result, we're seeing companies re-engaging in innovative and new initiatives to rethink their global strategies, organizational approaches, and business models. Mm-hmm. And then there's a great quote that we found from Accenture, a trends report. As companies continue to globalize and as talent becomes harder to find locally, companies will increasingly be composed of a global, highly diverse workforce. To thrive in this new environment, HR will need to reinvent itself to remain relevant and to help their organizations navigate a complex and changing global labor market. And so, Natacha, this is where I kind of want to bring you in, and as we read this and understand that the current talent landscape is shifting, that organizations, as I mentioned at the top, are rethinking their global programs. Mm-hmm. But as I'm sure you've come across in your career, that some of these global programs come with their fair share of complexities. So now is where I would like for us to talk about these complexities, kind of starting with the big one, implementing a talent strategy. So can you talk a little bit more about this one?
Sure. So thank you again for the opportunity. Yeah, so the previous slide definitely is what we're seeing in the hiring of great talent for different parts of the organizations, particularly in areas where there's a lot of skill shortage or hard to fill locations, right? So many mobility professionals will confirm this, that it's very difficult to move talent around the world. It takes a lot of energy on the part of a company, the employee and their family. It's very disruptive on many levels, and the costs are quite high. And to add, there's this fluid compliance risks and complexities that changes on a daily basis. When I look at this slide, I think of the reasons maybe could be twofold, right? When we look at hiring best talent, companies need to look at the flexibility of work location. And by that, I mean the ability to take on alternative work arrangements, right? It could be something around commuter programs. I know mobility is being pulled a lot into those discussions. It could be extended business travelers. Companies have seen an increase in that. And I think the companies struggle to get their heads around allowing employees to dictate the way they want to work. So I think that's definitely on the one side of why companies are facing challenges using relocation or some form of mobility to attract and retain talent. I think the other part of that could be that the provided support for these individuals who decide to take on, that disruption of moving to another location isn't always what they thought it was going to be, right? So it is not always as straightforward as moving somebody from one location to another. When somebody decides to move to another location, you need to consider that you're moving not only the employee, but the whole family. And typically companies have a defined mobility program which they're going to offer, right? So there's the tiered approach, or we're only going to offer this because our budget's restrictive. And they work on a one size fits all. And most mobility people struggle to convince the business that one size fits all doesn't work for an organization. And really, organizations need to start thinking about flexibility and personalization. So we could say that the reason companies are facing these challenges is because their relocation programs are probably one size fits all, or they've not looked at it from a very personalized or flexible point of view. I recently read an article on business.com that talked a little bit about the lack of mobility program adaptation, which essentially is echoing what I strongly advocate, which is that we really should present the best possible program for an employee who in return is going to present great value for the business, right? It's meeting them in the middle and looking at them from a personalized, again, flexible point of view. The article sort of rightly said that when companies tailor their mobility programs, they do find that they have the greatest success in attracting and retaining their talent, which, of course, I completely agree with that statement, having designed programs in the past and having looked at them from that point of view. I believe that companies who do take that viewpoint in programs start to see the perception of the companies looking after me going way much higher. The NPS scores are higher. The return on investment is higher. And so I think that when companies take the employee into consideration, start to see a greater return. I know a lot of people out there are thinking, oh my God, what about the budget? And the budget is a key factor when you design programs or when you look at moving people around the world. I don't believe it's restrictive on being flexible, personalized. A lot of people, when you think about flexible and personalized, you think large amounts of money, but you're not really, because what you need to do is find the balance between what you are offering against the budget, but allowing the employee to choose within that. Terms that people have heard are things like flexible with a structured approach, kind of two sides of the coin, but really looking at, if I have this amount of money, how can I make the employee feel like I really care about them within this bucket of money? It's not easy, but it can be done, and it's certainly not impossible. Even if the budget is tight, giving an employee the option within that budget will really turn the whole messaging around and potentially make the complexity around using relocation programs to retain and hire people a lot less of a complexity, so to speak. And I think that when we look at costs, we should always be aware that we're also in it for the business. So we're in it for the employee and we're in it for the business. And the mobility professionals, we always need to find the median between those two, the balancing piece. And I think that is also a great segue into, I believe, the next complexity, which is relocation costs.
Yeah. So Natacha, a quick question before I move on to the next one, which is a perfect segue. You mentioned flexible but with structure. Can you just briefly talk a little bit more about that?
So this is where you see the development of core flex programs, right? And also where you see the development of lump sum programs with a cap, right? It's the ability of still putting guardrails around what you've prepared or what the company is prepared to spend for a relocation, even if it's at a tiered approach, even if it's at a compensation, high-low type compensation approach. It is about looking at the program with some guardrails. And that's what I mean by flexible with a structured approach. It could be that you offer some basic needs that everybody requires when they move. You know, let's use household goods as an example. Most people, you know, if they're well-established families, would need a household goods move. So it might be that you say, you know, we'll pay for that, and then we'll give you some sort of a cash allowance on top of that to allow you to make some choices of your own, rather than me as the company saying, I know that you're married and have 2 children, so therefore I know you need this list of things, which might not be the reality of the situation.
Gotcha. Thank you. So then now we're going to move on to the next one. As you mentioned, the relocation costs, and toward that. What can you tell us about just how complex relocation costs can be?
Yeah, I think when you look at relocation costs, it sort of drives the conversation. And people who know me know that I've always said that when we move people, we should start with the talent discussion and then move to the financial discussion. And that is not always a reality for a lot of companies. I've recently worked with a lot of startup companies who obviously are watching every dollar, every cent, because they might be pre-IPO or something like that, right? And so they drive everything through financial discussions, right? I know that relocation costs can also be something that is so misunderstood within the relocation industry. It costs a lot of money to move people. There is no getting around that. Relocation is not cheap, and mobility professionals continuously have a tough task to help the business understand that those costs are for real. And while we can get creative on putting up guardrails or coming up with creative programs, and even talking to our third-party suppliers, you know, our relocation management companies or our immigration companies, how can we make some of these things a little bit cheaper? We can only influence to a point, right? Things cost what they cost, right? And so we need to think about that. You know, I suppose one of the other things, and I'm like thinking this at the same time while I'm speaking, that having said all of that, I also think that when you review certain programs, high costs can also be tied to the lack of process or badly designed process. It also could be tied to lack of technology. I think sometimes we have people doing things that maybe technology could be doing, or excuse me, there's program wastage. Program wastage can be defined by something that's really set up concrete. You know, this is what we offer and nothing else, and the employee can only use, you know, some of that, not all of it. And then we start this conversation around negotiating, right? You know, I don't really need this, so can I swap it for something else, right? And then that starts a whole another conversation, right, around exception management. What that also does, though, is that it changes, if you run cost estimates, it changes the cost estimate. Most companies, our financial colleagues particularly, will look at cost estimates to do budgeting or accruals. They look at past trends, create future budgets. We go off and make one-off exceptions or create one-off policies, and that sort of messes everything up, right? And you'll find that half the time these relocation costs are impacting more hires, right? Because there's no money left in the budget for further relocation. So then that impacts, hiring. So I think, there's a lot in what I've said there, but I think that costs can be managed if we look at it as part of setting up guardrails, working very closely with our financial colleagues to better understand what the financial philosophy for relocation is going to be against what the talent philosophy of relocation is going to be. And then design the program around that. Again, that's where you see a lot of really well-established mobility programs bringing in core and flex programs and variations of lump sum programs. It really is a juggling act in many, many ways, and not an easy one.
Definitely. So in your mind, would you say that cost estimates are set in stone, or are they more of an indication, or is there a different answer to that one?
No. So cost estimates are exactly what they are, estimates. And I cannot tell you how many times people get burnt with cost estimates. Cost estimates are a really good thing. If you're not running them, you should be running them. So get that off the table. We really should be doing them. But when we look at a cost estimate, we're looking at the current situation of an employee. The current situation of an employee does not predict the future situation of when they get to the other side. And by that, let's use an example. If somebody is leaving the US and they currently own a home, they're currently a family of 4, they currently have 3 bedrooms, lots of furniture. We work out a cost estimate on that. And it takes the employee and their significant other to talk through some of the stuff that they're going to do. And they decide to completely go on a limb and not take that furniture, but get something on the other side, move to a smaller place. They want to live on the canals in Amsterdam, which is a completely different ball game to the big house in Texas, right? And so we've run this cost estimate based on the current situation. And that is not a predictive of what's going to happen when they get the other side. So maybe what we should be doing is running cost estimates maybe at the beginning, and then re-looking them some way through the middle of a move and adjusting accordingly. It could go down, it could go up, but I think that that's what needs to be done. Moving with costs also implies moving with your financial colleagues and working closer with them, showing them the value also of what we do as mobility professionals, and that we don't just throw money at this situation, but that we look at it really from a very concise point of view, really understanding again what the employee needs, but also in line with what the business wants to spend.
Definitely. So Natacha, as we move on from relocation costs to our third complexity that we're going to discuss right here, the decentralization of internal programs. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about this one? I think it's clear that organizations need a coordinated internal mobility strategy, but wondering if you can add a little bit more context for our listeners on this one.
So sometimes I think this is a very elusive one. When it comes to internal mobility, it appears that a lot of the time, internal mobility is designed without internal mobility people. And that, for me, is a slight pet hate, to be honest with you. I recently read an article, an HR technologist that spoke to the complexities of internal mobility, and they wrote that it's actually 2 sides of this complexity. One is actually identifying the talent on the business side, and the other one is, does the employee actually want to go, right? Whether they feel that the company would actually support them in doing that. And putting those 2 together, it's really important that a company includes their mobility professional or mobility leader in the conversation about the internal mobility strategy, right? It is one of those things where you need a coordinated approach between what the employee needs, what the business needs, and what mobility knows can be done for the employee and for the business, always playing the middle ground, always making sure that we're looking at both sides of this to make sure that the strategy is in line with not only the expectation of the employee, but the expectation of the business. Because what the business really wants is that person there to hit the ground running. And that sometimes cannot happen because we've left something really important out on the employee side and their family. Again, when we move employees, we're moving an entire entity, we're moving a whole family. And I always want us to remember that, because it can be, while the employee is going to be at the office, the family is going to be trying to, navigate their new environment. We always want to make sure that we understand how that is going to play out for them. It also helps us to get ahead of anything that can be mismanaged from a compliance point of view, right? Compliance is really important, and we want to avoid situations, and I can only imagine that a lot of my mobility professionals will also know this, and a lot of my HR professionals will remember this as well, because it's probably happened to them, where a manager has told us that somebody's going to be an easy, quote unquote, move. But when we dig a little bit deeper, it becomes like the nightmare move. Right? And that is because we haven't been part of the internal mobility conversation with this individual. We haven't been at the front end of it, rather than at the end where they've already given them the offer and they're already heading out the door. Right? I think that should internal mobility strategies be centralized? I'm not sure that I 100% agree that everything should be centralized or decentralized. I think it depends on the organization whether something should be centralized or decentralized. What I do think needs to be consistent is the philosophy around internal mobility, right? Doesn't matter where you move your people, who you approach, but the philosophy must be the same. The technique of choosing who should be going should be the same, because otherwise it creates that sort of inequity that happens within the business. And then tied to that is, what are we going to offer based on the situation? And then based on, again, being flexible and being personalized for that family. I really think that helps drive the different messaging around, we really looking after you, and the employee will be more inclined to meet the business in the middle when they know that the business actually cares.
Definitely. Thanks. So you mentioned sending employees overseas, obviously, and then moving forward, as we take a look at this slide, long-term and short-term assignments. Natacha, as I'm sure you're well aware of, short-term or long-term assignments present a variety of challenges. Can you talk a little bit more about some of these challenges and I guess the business strategy on how to deal with these challenges?
Yeah, I was actually, when I was doing some pre-reads on the slides and I looked at this long-term versus short-term assignments, I was kind of conflicted because there is a shift in the business, right, where you're starting to see in some parts of the industries, particularly tech industry, maybe even some of the other sort of forward-thinking industries, where people are walking away from the word assignment or anything tied to assignment. So really? It was sort of an interesting thing to, slide to look at as one of the complexities. But I think that is the complexity. I think, in my opinion, really, there isn't one solution. It depends on the reason for the assignment, the strategic objective of the role, the willingness of employees to go on assignment, right? And we can actually define assignment as anything that involves them leaving a current location and going to another one. That assignment could be within a country like the US, it could be internationally, it could be within Europe, cross-border, but it is that one moment where they actually take the time to think about moving from one location to another, the disruption that will come with that, how do they handle everything when they get to the other side, the unknown of the other side. I think the ideal situation on deciding whether somebody goes on a long, a short, or any other type of move is to really work with HR and to discuss what would work best for both the employee and the business, and finding a solution for for them both, right? What would work for both of them? We know that compliance is a big thing, right? That's your taxes, your immigration, your social security. If you're moving an employee that's older out of the US, there's the whole social security thing, there's the 401k. There are many aspects of a move that you need to consider outside of the, oh, I need to move your house, your dog, fly you over there, and sell your car, right? That to me is a sort of the easy part of the whole thing. I think what makes it really difficult is understanding the impact that it will have on the individual and their family, both short-term and long-term. And once you understand the impact that it will have on the individual, I think then you start to think about, well, on what basis are we sending that individual? Is it a long-term because we know that they're later on in their career and that's something we need to think about? Or is it something that's more short-term because we really want them there, finish a project and leave, right? What is the objective? Right. What is the disruption? I think that it's really important to look at how do we balance the business needs against the employee expectations. I also see, and on this long-term, short-term, I'm also seeing a trend at the moment, and I know all the mobility professionals around the table will also know this and see this, is that there are a lot of this requests coming through for extended business travelers, right? And I know we're going to touch on that a little bit later, so we'll dive a little bit deeper into that. But extended business travelers, by all definition or by any other definition for me, it's sort of like a short-term assignment if they're going longer than, let's say, 30 or 60 days, depending on where your company draws a line, right, from a compliance point of view. It allows the company to move quicker on something they're trying to get done, or it allows less disruption for a family, particularly if children are in sort of later stages of schooling, for example. And it also lets the company think about cost containment. What are we going to offer around that, right? And so you start to see short-term assignments, business travelers, extended business travelers, frequent business travelers all start to blend a little bit, and we start to get more creative. And I suppose it ties back into sort of the first two slides, right? What is the talent strategy and how do we implement it, and how can we get people to move to make that strategy work? But then how do we do it in a cost-conscious way, right? And I think this slide allows us to start to think about that long-term, short-term. There's even this conversation about one-way move, right? A permanent move with sort of nuances tied to that. So that's where this starts to become more of a conversation around what do we provide, and then what's the underlying need for compliance around, what compliances we need to think about, So yeah.
Natacha, I just sent you a question. I think it was a very interesting one from an audience member as we're discussing the long-term or short-term assignments. As you mentioned that some of the terminology is moving away from this. So this attendee is asking, what are forward-thinking companies' thoughts around changing the terminology of quote an assignment? What is the new terminology, and can you expand on this?
Sure. So it's interesting. In the last couple of months, I've spent some time talking to, as I mentioned earlier, a few newer companies starting with mobility functions. And they're walking away from the word assignment because traditionally the word assignment implies housing and drivers and relocation allowances or assignment allowances and all the things that has been traditionally tied with the word assignment. So we're starting to see, and something I've used in the past is things like working abroad or rotation. We have had people call commuters, commuters can be, somebody who goes there and back, but how long they stay is a question, right, for up to the company, right? And so you start to see words that mean something a little bit differently. Do I think that the terminology is going to change? I think it depends on the company. In a lot more traditional companies who still have traditional assignments, that's not going to go away. We know that will stay. But where companies want to be a little bit different or start to think a little bit differently, you're going to see them using working abroad or working away or extended travel. There's another one, extended stay, came up once or twice for me. So that is definitely what you're going to start seeing from a terminology point of view. Do I think it's any, so just by definition of the word changing doesn't mean that the behind the scenes things change, right? And by that I mean your compliance still remains your compliance. You still need immigration the same way you did before. You still need tax consultation or some form of tax support the way you did before. Your stock is still going to be treated the same way. Nothing like that changes. But what it allows the company to do is on the front end design the benefits that will work within the cost containment or within what the philosophy is for that company.
Gotcha. Thanks for asking that question. Was there anything else on this current slide, the long-term and short-term, or versus short-term assignments?
No, we'll pick up on the travelers a little bit later on the slides.
Perfect. So I know you mentioned a few times on this particular slide the word compliance, and I think it's going to lead us perfectly into our next one. So Natacha, before I ask just a question, I mean, we all know that compliance is a huge part of everything, as you're saying, taxes and whatnot, and it's also a big part of traveling. And just briefly, I just want to touch on how technology can help with regards to travel and compliance. As I'm sure everyone knows, when a foreign national is traveling, they have to update their I-94 info, and technology allows that to be integrated with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So these I-94s are automatically an updated data retrieval, and this helps ensure compliance. Natacha, in what other ways can you talk about just how complex compliance can be and what companies can do about it?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Recently, with my experiences in startups, I noticed that compliance is what comes to the table when they suddenly realize that they need somebody or a company to help them with mobility, because tax and immigration laws are scary. To most companies, they're scary. They don't understand them. They move on a daily basis. Every morning we see something new in the news. It scares the employees. They don't know what that means. And so what we've seen is that most of the time when companies realize they need somebody to do that, it was generated from that conversation, right? Borders are definitely getting tighter. We know that bureaucracy is getting worse, right? The political landscape is in complete disarray. We know that by the people who understand that nobody else around us understands it. So how do we find a way to dummy down compliance complexity and communicate that to the business, right? How do we find a better way to tell our employees what it means for them when they travel internationally, or when they get a visa, or when they hear something on the news? What should they do? The nervousness that I have seen in my employees, working within the mobility function, the employees that come to us, every time a news story comes out, we are flooded on our inboxes with concerned employees for their families, for what's next, right? And as companies, we need to think about a way to deal with that. And I believe we need to lean on our third-party providers, people like yourselves, to help us do that. We are not immigration experts, unless we are the immigration expert in the team, of course, but as mobility leaders who sit at the table with the talent leaders, with the HR leaders, with the business leaders, we don't always have all the answers at our fingertips. And it would be really great to have that given to us in very digestible pieces to then communicate to our leaders. Our leaders also don't know what this all means, and it is up to us to help them understand. And the complexities on compliance is the non-understanding of those compliance things that keep coming through in our news boxes every morning.
Right. And as we head to our last, I guess we'll just call it complexity, but briefly, kind of leads, it's a perfect segue, but just a further highlighting how technology can help when it comes to setting up and managing global mobility programs. You're able to use a piece of tech to determine the authorization needed for an employee's international assignment. For instance, Natasha, if like someone needs a business visa versus a work permit, and then also provides content on requirements for business visas and work permits. Again, kind of to your point, just helping managers plan ahead. So really, we're seeing just how these days technology is becoming a bigger important part of managing global mobility programs. And Natasha, I think this is the one that you were going to discuss further, but
Right.
travel tracking, which is our sixth complexity that we decided to discuss. So as we arrive on this one, what can you tell our listeners kind of about the complexities of tracking their employees? I know that
Yeah.
sounds a little bit, but yeah.
No, that's great. So as I mentioned in the one of the previous slides, right, extended or frequent business travelers or working abroad or extended stay, whatever we might want to call those sort of less than those non-traditional assignment type programs, is that it's becoming more of a regular topic. I know that every forum I attend or every conversation that I have, it seems to creep its way into, oh, what are we doing about tracking business travelers? And the reason it's such a headache for so many people and a big concern is that half the time we don't know where people are, or they go and they think they know what they're doing. And half the time we have no way of tracking them. We know they're going, but we have no way of tracking them. And as you mentioned, there is technology out there. It's becoming more and more available today. It's only recently that we start to see more and more of proper tracking. Before it was a case of spreadsheets. I think we still all have our trusty spreadsheet. And so we're starting to see technology take over the trusty spreadsheet, right?
Right.
But we don't always know that people are traveling. We don't always know where they're going, and we definitely don't know how long they're staying, because most people, particularly if they're on a visa that allows them to cross borders, no problem, European visa or something like that, there's no need for them to tell us that they're doing what they're doing. But they should be, because we all know that it depends on what they're doing in the new location when you look at immigration or when you look at the taxes, right? The tracking of the global population around business travelers is something that I think we should be taking very seriously. But then there's the question, where does it sit and who is responsible? And
Right.
we have that come up quite often in conversations about, well, mobility are being asked to do that, and mobility is saying, no, that's not our job, that's travel's job, right? They should be the ones tracking it. So here's where I go out on a limb and say that I think mobility should be a lot more involved in travel tracking. I think that internally, companies can do a better job of tracking them, the travelers, through the mobility function. When somebody needs a visa, they automatically think mobility, they don't think travel. And so what happens is that there should be a closer connection between mobility and travel. I'm not saying that mobility should take over business travelers, but I do think we should be closer involved in making sure that there's an understanding of what needs to happen when somebody travels, that we know that they are traveling, that we can be ahead of the game in, to your point earlier, assessing what they need before they go, being part of the conversation around making sure that they're not going to run into trouble when they get the other side. I think that we also should be involved in helping communicate through the business things that people need to think about when they travel. I mentioned earlier that the borders are getting tighter. We all know that, and the political situation changes on a daily basis, and we want to make sure that people know where they need to be, when they need to be, and we need to know how long they're going to be there, so that if something does go wrong, and this is the other part of the conversation, is where do we bring the duty of care into this conversation, right? Where do we know that somebody is in a country where something has happened, right? And how do we then help them get out of that situation? I think when we talk about business travelers, we're so focused on the compliance, we also forget the duty of care. And again, as I said, we need to play, mobility does need to play a bigger role in the travel. I think it depends on the organization whether mobility will take on travel, but I have already seen mobility and travel becoming one function under something like a employee experience type team or a center of excellence.
Right. And we all know how important the employee experience is.
Mm-hmm.
So Natacha, I guess that's going to bring us to kind of our key takeaways. I don't know, any final thoughts on just kind of the main presentation before we hop into the main Q&A? I know one of your big emphasis was on third-party relationships and just how important they are. Just curious if you had any other additional thoughts.
Yeah, I think when it comes to mobility teams within corporations, it is very important for those teams to have great relationships with their third-party providers, for third-party providers to help them look good in front of their business, right? To help them, to educate them on trends that are coming down the line, to give them, as I mentioned earlier, digestible bits of information that they can share to show their value. Because when we are in the strategy mode of we need to hire people, we need to move people, we need to make sure that they're doing, everything is working the way it should be, they're receiving the services on time. What we don't have time for is understanding what's happening on the peripheral sides, right? What is happening in the industry? What is happening from a trending point of view? And sometimes we don't even have time to think about that. And so we really rely on our third-party providers to come to us and say, I know you're really busy, but here is something that we've seen starting to trend. You might want to just keep this on in your back pocket, because it might happen that you might need to bring it out as a conversation item. And so I think that is really important. The other piece is picking, for us mobility people, is picking, this is actually a complexity in its own, I think, as well, is picking providers that match the culture of the organization, that understands the philosophy of the organization, that can move as an extension of the team that's already internally sitting within the organization. That team might be one person or a whole group of people, right? But it's still an extension of that company. It's almost like as if they sat within the company. I strongly believe that our partners are part of our team, and we should treat them as such, and then they should provide us the information as such as well to help us become better at what we do within the organization.
Definitely. All right. Well, that brings us to the second half of our presentation. I see it's 1:42, so we still have some time just for some questions. Everyone that's currently listening in, if you have a question for Natacha, please send it our way so we can look at it and hopefully get to it. And as we wait for these questions to come in, I just want to quickly plug a couple of webinars we have coming up next week. Next Tuesday, March 12th, 3 things to triple check before submitting H-1B cap petition. The H-1B cap petition season is come rapidly approaching, so just kind of one final check in our H-1B cap series. And then also next week, we'll be discussing STEM, OPT, and CAP in 2019. And then also just want to remind everyone that to stay subscribed to our mailing list, follow us on all the social media channels so you can stay in the loop on the latest updates, including when our 2019 Immigration Trends Report is going to be coming out. It's going to be very exciting and touch on some of these things that Natacha touched about on today's presentation. All right, so Natacha, let's dive into the questions. So the first complexity that we had discussed in this presentation was around implementing a talent strategy. So do companies typically tailor the package to the employee?
We wish they did. No. So I think the level of tailoring will depend on the organization. I think there is a level of tailoring in every program in some form or fashion, right? In core and flex, there's a level of tailoring, right? You're giving them these few benefits, and then you maybe adding a list of benefits above that somebody can choose from. That's some form of tailoring. But what happens there is you're still sitting with a list of benefits that maybe doesn't work for every generation or doesn't work for every person in their personal situation. Would I like to see that people tailor it more from the point of view of it's understanding the needs? Yeah, sure. Is that a reality? Probably not every time, because if you're moving thousands of people, that's not a reality. What we need to think about there is maybe around making sure that whatever we do present from a list of benefits does cover the typical family or the typical generation or whatever it is, so that we're starting to think that way. But when we look at internal mobility, I believe we should be talking to every single person that moves internally in some form or fashion. And that might be as simple as creating a technology that starts that process, or it is actually a verbal conversation. And when I say speaking, I mean speaking in inverted commas. It could be as simple as creating a technology that starts the process. There are companies who've done that in some, either a form wizard or the technology starts the process, and then based on what the form says or based on what the employers responded, they then can start the conversation in person with whoever they need to talk to. So yes, there's some form of tailoring. We should be seeing more of it, particularly as we talk about internal mobility strategy, definitely more of it. But there is some form of it happening.
Gotcha. All right. So as we move on to our next question here, so obviously, so we highlighted 6 different complexities in this presentation, but as I'm sure Natacha, as you're well aware, and as many of our listeners are well aware, there are many more complexities or challenges. So Natacha, throughout your career, what are some of these other challenges that you've seen?
Okay, so other challenges. One of the challenges I think that's very prominent right now is the ability for global mobility to get a place at the table, right? When you break down all the ways that we look at making the business successful through mobility, and we talked about that in the very first slide, that people are not confident or they're not able to retain or hire through the mobility program, you realize how important it is for companies to bring mobility into that talent discussion, right? The complexity is, how do you achieve that, right? How do you help the business, or how do you inform the business what value you can bring to the table as a mobility professional? In some companies, that's more difficult than others, but it's about working to change the perception of mobility from a very administrative function, which a lot of companies still see that way, to a very much more strategic part of the business. And it is changing. I'd like to see it change a lot quicker than it is today. I'd like to see companies put more value on understanding the landscape of mobility, understanding what the function is up against, understanding what we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and to sort of maybe walk in our shoes a little bit more, so that we can be more they can understand us more, so we can add more value to them. But therein lies the difficult task, right? It's a daily struggle. How do we do this on a daily basis? And I don't know that there is an answer to it, other than within each company, we need to suss out what that looks like and continue that quote unquote struggle to get to the table. So again, some companies got it right, some companies haven't.
Right. And I think that kind of leads into this next question. So it appears that global mobility's role will need to change. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and that has actually come up in a lot of conversations. I think recently at one of the latest ERC, and I think also at one latest BAM meeting that's in the Bay Area. There was this talk about how does the role of mobility look in the future, right? I read an article that was put out by Brookfield recently. I think it was last year, May, I'm not 100% sure, where the future of global mobility professional was discussed in this article. And they listed a few key skill sets that is required for mobility to move from this very administrative type role to a very strategic role. Some of them I've already touched on. I think that we as mobility professionals need to take on more of a consultative type role, right? We need to educate and guide the business in the right direction, given the chance to do so. I think we need to let the business decide on how they want to move with a particular situation based on our recommendations. Ultimately, I think we need them to make the decision, and we need to guide them in that decision. And it's things like when somebody wants to go to a country and we know that the visa will take 3 months to get, right? And we need to guide them into, maybe you shouldn't be traveling there in the 3 months, let's get the visa, right? Managers get impatient. They don't understand why things are happening. And it's for us to give them the full picture, to really think as if we are coming in from the outside. And I think there's a lot of value to that. The other thing is we need to understand the business better. There was a time, I remember when I first started in mobility, where mobility sort of sat on the outskirts and sort of did everything that was coming their way. You know, the offers would fly our way and we had to just make sure the vendor was doing whatever they were supposed to be doing. We didn't understand why somebody was going somewhere, for what reason they were going somewhere. And I think it would be it would help us a lot to get a lot more business acumen, to understand the business a lot more, understand the big picture, and then the various strategies within that. What would it take for us to get a better understanding of what the talent hiring strategy is, or the mobility, the internal movement strategy? You know, we're going to open an office somewhere. What does that look like, right? We're starting to see that a lot more in a lot more progressive companies. The other piece that I think we need to get a little bit tighter on is working with our financial colleagues. How do we report in this company? On what basis do we report? How do our mobility costs impact the bottom line? I think those are very important pieces, or very important questions that we need to understand, so that we can do a better job of negotiating the next contract that we have, or understanding why things cost, you know, what they do, or why we can bring those costs down, and can we bring those costs down? Mobility is a very big part. Mobility costs are a very big part of the financials, particularly when you're moving more than 1,000 people, if not more, right? It does impact the bottom line. And I would say that the final two skill sets in this article that I read, that I think are foundational for every mobility professional, one of them is vendor management. I think if we cannot work with our vendors, I know I've mentioned this already, but vendor management is key, because we need to work with strategic sourcing or procurement. We have to help them understand why we've picked certain vendors to present, why we decide on certain vendors to run our program, why we've asked them to do what we've needed to ask them to do. Vendor management is a continuously daily task. It's not something we put in place and walk away from. We need to make sure their statement of work is happening, that the service level agreement is happening, that we know they are providing the benefits that we need in the way that we need them, on time and such. Because when an employee is upset, they're not going to go to the vendor, they're going to come to us, right? So we need to understand that. And then the second one of that is problem-solving abilities. I think the problem-solving abilities is so key in every mobility professional's role. Particularly when we think that families, I always say this, people who know me say that, I say families are like fingerprints, everyone is different, right? Everyone's going to have something nuanced that you're going to need to deal with, and sometimes really uncomfortably have to deal with. But the point is, you have to think, for a better cliche, outside of the box a lot of the time. And so problem-solving skill abilities is really key. For me, those are instrumental in any success of a mobility professional.
Gotcha. Thank you. Very, very great answer there. So Natacha, we have about 7-8 minutes left, and I have one final question here. Any parting words of wisdom from your years in global mobility?
Oh, wisdom. Yes. You're only as good as the last move you made. No, that's not a parting wisdom, but there you go. Giggle, giggle. I think that people who know me know that I've always said this, and that is, when you are presented with a complex problem or something that isn't working or a complaint, never take sides. Never make it sound like you are accepting an employee's concern over a vendor's concern, or a vendor's concern over an employee's concern. Always do your due diligence. I think the best way to handle anything that comes your way is to say, let me look into this, and I will circle back to you once I've had a good chance to understand the situation, make the judgment call or make the decision or consider what needs to be done, and I will come back to you. When you take sides, when you commiserate with anybody or agree to anything, you have already lost the ability to go back, and then you're going to start having very uncomfortable conversations because the person feels like you've already sided with them. So I think when presented with anything, remain in the middle ground, listen to what's happening, make your judgment call, and then circle back with the people around what you think should happen. Ultimately, again, managers make decisions, HR makes decisions, but at least present the case in the way you think it should be seen. That
Great.
would be it.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening in. I hope everyone found this presentation very informative. Natacha, thank you so much for taking the time out today to join us. Very insightful. A lot of great answers to these questions. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
And then just before we sign off for the day, just this recording will be sent out to everyone currently listening in. So you can listen to it tomorrow, Thursday. Tomorrow is Thursday. You can listen to it tomorrow morning, afternoon, Friday morning, or whenever you want. All right. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.